Sure.
And Senator Johnson is next.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Curry, let me start with this statement that I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not a climate change alarmist. I get a feeling from listening to your testimony, maybe you're a little bit more on that scale with me than more of an alarmist. But I thought it was interesting in your testimony you talked about when you look at the real history of occurrences of hurricanes, I've certainly looked at the history of wildfires, that there's really nothing out of the ordinary in terms of long-term perspective on this. Can you expand a little bit more on what you're talking about? You're just referring to that in general. Can you get a little more specific?
Sure. Looking back in the historical record of extreme events that, in the first half of the 20th century, particularly the 1930s, the weather and climate extremes were much worse than anything we've seen so far in the 21st century, in terms of the worst landfalling hurricane, the worst heat waves, the worst droughts, the worst fires, and on it goes. And if you look at the paleoclimate record, you can extend even further back, and you see evidence of even, greater extremes. The worst atmospheric river event in recorded history occurred in the 1861 to 1862 winter in California. I mean, we think it's bad this year, but it was much worse back in the 19th century, and even worse events that you can see in the paleoclimate records. So we need to temper our perception of what's actually going on right now with the extreme events.
So I appreciate that. And, we mentioned earlier witness talked about Silicon Valley Bank and what's happening there. What you have is a lack of confidence. And so if we have all these hair on fire predictions, it's going to reduce confidence, and it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's talk about the reality. You just talked a little bit about the reality of extreme events not being out of the ordinary. Mr. Theodoro, for my sake, again, I don't deny the loss in property, but isn't that more related to the fact that we are building incredibly expensive properties in highly vulnerable areas, whether it's in mudslide areas in California or wildfire areas where we're not doing proper forest management to prevent wildfires? What we're building on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic shoreline, unbelievably expensive property. So when a hurricane does occur, there's going to be a lot of property damage. So isn't the real issue here properly pricing the insurance and, quite honestly, making the owners pay for the risk that they're taking? And we don't do that. We subsidize that risk, and so there's more risk taking. Can you just kind of speak to that?
Yes, thank you, Senator Johnson, for the question. And it's both. And indeed, there are more values now that are at risk. There is more unsound development on coastal areas and on floodplains. There's more impervious surfaces, as you have asphalt instead of dirt to absorb the water. So you have higher values, and that's the driver of the higher losses. But also, there are more of these extreme events. The 1861-1862 arc storm in California that led to Governor-elect Leland Stanford going to his inauguration in a rowboat in Sacramento was considered a 1-in-1,000-year event. That's why it was called an arc storm, A-R-K, atmospheric river K for 1,000. Research has shown that it was actually happening every 200 years. But more recent research from NOAA is now saying that this can happen every 40 or 50 years. So there are more of these extreme events. And as you said...
Okay, that's contrary to what Dr. Curry is talking about, but go on. By the way, do you have, the insurance industry, have you calculated the property value in these vulnerable areas today versus, let's say, 50 years ago? I mean, do you have a sense of how much more property is at risk? Whether or not we have more extreme events, I mean, when an event occurs, we're going to have a lot more property damage.
Yeah, the industry does tabulate this, and there are modelers that look at that. But indeed, the values have gone up because of population growth and building which is not sound. It's on coastal areas and on floodplains, not built to code. So that's an important factor, and we should discourage this sort of bad behavior. and have protections, mitigation. But the evidence, the facts are looking at the events and the severity of the events that have been more frequency of severity.
So my point is that's something we can do something about, not building in vulnerable areas. We can do something about building to code. I don't think we can hold back the tides. So why don't we address what we can actually do versus scare the you-know-what out of everybody, reduce confidence. That doesn't help either. So thank you, Mr. Theodoro.
Thank you.